Angeles. Welcome to Eagle News International. Good evening, CJ.
Good evening, Alma, and good evening to everyone joining the broadcast. Here are tonight's headlines.
Huawei executive Mang Wanzhou heads home from Vancouver as two Canadians are also released from prison in China, ending a bitter diplomatic road that has poisoned ties for 3 years.
Fresh volcanic eruptions in Spain's Canary Islands prompted the cancellation of flights, airport authorities said, the first since the Cumbre Vieja volcano came to life again.
The Department of Health observed a slower rate of increase in COVID-19 cases in the National Capital Region and at the national level.
She was called the leader of the free world as authoritarian populists were on the march in Europe and the United States, but Angela Merkel is wrapping up a historic 16 years in power.
Style of calm.
First, the chief financial officer of Huawei has reached a deal with the U.S. Justice Department to resolve criminal charges against her and allow her to return to China. Mang Wanzhou admitted to misleading a bank about the Chinese communication giant's business with Iran. Mang and the two Canadians, former diplomat Michael Kovrig and businessman Michael Spavor, are all on their way back to their home countries after years of being detained in what critics have called hostage diplomacy. Take a look.
About 12 minutes ago, the aircraft carrying Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor left Chinese airspace and they're on their way home. They boarded at about 7:30 Ottawa time, along with Dominic Barton, Canada's ambassador to China.
The two Michaels were detained just days after Mang on what Ottawa has contended were trumped-up espionage charges. In turn, Beijing called Mang's case a purely political incident. The resolution of the case removes a deep thorn in the relationship between Beijing, Washington, and Ottawa, with China accusing the U.S. of a political attack on one of its technology titans. Washington had accused her of fraud against HSBC Bank and wire fraud, saying she tried to hide violations of U.S. sanctions on Iran by Huawei affiliate Skycom. But on Friday, U.S. prosecutors settled for Mang, agreeing to a statement of facts in the case. And in exchange, they agreed to defer the charges until 2022 and then drop them if Mang abides by the terms of the agreement. Let's listen in.
Over the past 3 years, my life has been turned upside down. It was a disruptive time for me as a mother, a wife, and a company executive. But I believe every cloud has a silver lining. It really was an invaluable experience in my life.
The charges and Mang's arrest were enmeshed in a broader campaign against Huawei, a private firm that Washington says is closely tied to the Chinese government and People's Liberation Army. U.S. officials say Huawei's phones, routers, and switching equipment used widely around the world offer Chinese intelligence a potent backdoor into global communications. Huawei denies that it has any ties to the Chinese military.
A bitter diplomatic spat between Canada, China, and the United States drew to a close on Friday as Ottawa released Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou, and Beijing freed two Canadians who have been held in what critics call hostage diplomacy. An analyst says that the hostage diplomacy strategy worked for China to some degree, but also affected the country's image around the world. Take a look.
China may be tempted to use that hostage diplomacy again because it has worked to some degree. But at the same time, it has contributed to deteriorating China's image around the world and China's relationship with many of its key partners. And it's a precedent which is going to have, of course, an impact on many countries and many nationals residing on China. People are going to be much more cautious before getting into China. So, of course, with Canada, it's a big relief for two reasons. First of all, because the two Michaels release, but also because it may help putting back the China-Canada relationship on track. Well, I think both sides have taken something out of this battle. The US, because, as I said, Meng Wanzhou recognized that her case was a criminal case, and there were some wrongdoings made by Huawei and by herself, particularly in hiding Huawei's connection to Iran and then the financial connections to Iran. And that's something which, of course, could have led her to be extradited and prosecuted in the US. Well, I think China is going to declare, to turn Meng Wanzhou's release into a big victory, a diplomatic victory, and the government is going to develop a pretty active propaganda around that case, just to to sort of maybe minimize or ignore the accusations against her and give the illusion that she was wrongly accused of crimes she never committed. But that's a story for the domestic audience, I would say. But that doesn't put Huawei out of the wood. I think Huawei is still under a number of accusations, and Huawei is on the blacklist. And, it's been blacklisted by the U.S. administration. And Huawei has become, as a company, has become a real issue and security issue in many countries, including in Canada.
Now, she was called the leader of the free world as authoritarian populists were on the march in Europe and the United States. But Angela Merkel is wrapping up a historic 16 years in power with an uncertain legacy at home and abroad. Take a look.
After 16 years, German Chancellor Angela Merkel is stepping down. In her time at the helm, she's steered the country through a number of major European crises with her signature style of calm, rationality and caution. Born in West Germany but raised in the East, she spent her childhood here in the town of Templin before going on to study physics at university. The future German Chancellor entered politics at the age of 35 after the fall of the Berlin Wall and quietly climbed the ranks of the Christian Democratic Union, becoming party leader in 2000.
All those men in the West German CDU who were already around in the early years of the CDU, who were career party politicians, couldn't really imagine that this woman from the East was going to take a leading position, party leader, chancellor, not at all. But of course, she always benefited greatly from being underestimated.
3 years into power, she faced her first storm, the global financial crisis. Merkel pushed for fiscal austerity to save the euro, something the Greeks can never forgive.
She represents the bailout programme, the most difficult period, when they imposed poverty, reduction of pensions and wages, increase of prices. Generally speaking, this is the biggest crisis that Greece has experienced in the last 30 years. Within days of the 2011 Fukushima disaster, she decided to phase out nuclear power in Germany. In 2014, she mediated between Russia and Ukraine. And in 2015, Angela Merkel made one of the most important decisions of her career, opening Germany's borders to thousands of refugees from Iraq and Syria, despite a public backlash.
A selfie she took with Anas, a Syrian asylum seeker in Berlin, became a potent symbol of her migration policy.
Und Frau Merkel für mich ist die Heldin in meinen Augen.
Mrs. Merkel is the heroine who saved my life in my eyes. She gave me the chance to enter this country, to integrate, to feel good here. She offered me safety. For me, she is the most powerful woman in the world.
Für mich sie ist die stärkste Frau der Welt.
Merkel's path to re-election in 2017 was far from smooth. Her popularity took a hit from the migrant crisis. The far right entered parliament and coalition talks were protracted. The following year, she announced that she would not run for re-election.
Zugleich habe ich das sichere Gefühl, dass es heute an der Zeit ist,
I think we have to open a new chapter, and it's time for me to share some of my decisions. I will not be a candidate for the presidency of the CDU.
Erstens, auf dem nächsten Bundesparteitag der CDU im Dezember in Hamburg werde ich nicht wieder für das Amt der Vorsitzenden der CDU Deutschlands kandidieren. Zweitens,
And this fourth term is my last as Chancellor of
meine
Germany.
letzte als Bundeskanzlerin der Bundesrepublik Deutschland.
In 2019, bouts of severe trembling provoked speculation about her health. But any concerns about her ability to govern were allayed amid the coronavirus pandemic. Her handling of the crisis, deemed clear and rational, has boosted her popularity ratings.
Für jemanden wie mich
Rest assured, for someone like me, for whom travel and freedom of movement are a hard-won right, such restrictions are only legitimately established in cases of absolute need. In a democracy, such decisions should never be taken lightly, but for now, they are essential to save lives.
Leben zu retten.
In August, 3/4 of Germans said they were satisfied with her work. But young Germans aren't so sure.
Also ich finde, sie ist in Krisen gut.
She has always been good in a crisis. She has also shown good leadership. But there are still many things that bother me slightly. For example, she doesn't care enough about climate policy.
Schon ein bisschen stören. Zum Beispiel, sag ich mal, finde ich, kümmert sie sich nicht genug um Klimapolitik.
The 2021 election marks the end of a political era for Germany and for the European Union. And while Angela Merkel has been coy about her retirement plans, she has listed two priorities: travel and a nap.
The last, mostly Haitian migrants who camped illegally under a Texas bridge, sparking a major border crisis for President Joe Biden's administration, have left or have been removed. Alejandro Mayorkas, Homeland Security Secretary, said some 12,400 were allowed into the U.S. to seek asylum. He also expressed outrage over scenes of Border Patrol agents whipping migrants at the border. Take a look.
As of this morning, there are no longer any migrants in the camp underneath the Del Rio International. Images horrified us in terms of what they suggest and what they conjure up in terms of not only our nation's history, but unfortunately the fact that that page of history has not been turned entirely. And that means that there is much work to do, and we are very focused on doing it. But I will not prejudge the facts. I do not in any way want to impair the integrity of the investigative process. Let me be clear. The department does not tolerate any mistreatment of any migrant and will not tolerate any violation of its values, principles, and ethics.
Mayorkas said the most vulnerable, including those with medical issues or making claims of having been tortured, are put into the immigration system and will have their futures decided by a court. The top Biden administration official was speaking after an uproar over photos that showed confrontations between Border Patrol officers on horseback and Haitian migrants on foot.
In other news, the first confirmed human West Nile virus case has recently been reported on a Winnipeg resident. Eagle News correspondent Joshua Santillana tells us more.
On Thursday, September 16, in Toronto, Canada, Toronto public health officials released a statement announcing the first human case of West Nile virus of 2021 within the city. According to the Government of Canada website, West Nile virus is a disease transmitted from the bite of an infected mosquito to humans and other animals. Mosquitoes usually become infected after feeding on an infected bird. Only in rare cases will West Nile be transmitted from human to human through the following: blood transfusion, organ or tissue transplants, pregnancy from mothers to unborn babies, breast milk, exposure to laboratory workers to infected medical specimens. Symptoms of the virus usually appear within 2 to 15 days since the infection and can range from mild to severe. Those 50 years and older or have weakened immune systems are at greater risk of developing severe symptoms. However, most typical symptoms include fever, headache, body aches, mild rash, swollen lymph glands. In 2020, the city confirmed 33 cases of the West Nile virus in humans, and while the risk of getting infected remained low within the city, the Toronto Public Health advises taking precautionary measures such as wearing light-colored clothing and covering up, applying insect repellent containing DEET or icaridin, taking extra care during dusk and dawn, which are peak mosquito biting hours, making sure homes have tight-fitting screens on windows and doors, and removing standing water from properties where mosquitoes can breed. In Toronto, Joshua Santillana, Eagle News, we live in interesting times.
President Joe Biden and the leaders of Australia, India, and Japan promised Friday to work together for a stable, open, and democratic Indo-Pacific in a veiled dig at China during their first in-person summit together. In Biden's latest effort to cement U.S. leadership in the face of a rising China, the so-called Quad agreed to move ahead on a joint plan to provide COVID-19 vaccines around Asia, launched a new climate initiative, and said the four nations would begin holding annual summits. Without any explicit mention of China, the leaders of the four democracies in a joint statement said they were committed to promoting the free, open, rules-based order rooted in international law and undaunted by coercion. During virtual talks in March, the Quad leaders said they would supply more than 1 billion vaccines by the end of 2022, with India providing production, Japan and the United States financing, and Australia the logistics.
Meanwhile, Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga said Japan will closely collaborate with like-minded countries and regions towards achieving a free and open Indo-Pacific. In a pre-recorded speech to the UN General Assembly, take a look.
お祈り申します。私は力ではなく自由で開かれた国際秩序こそがその根底にあるべきと確信しています。これを実現するためのビジョンが自由で開かれたインド太平洋です。国際社会の平和と安全を脅かすものです。北朝鮮が外交的取り組みに関与し、非核化についての米朝間の対話が進展することを強く期待します。関係国、機関とも緊密に連携してまいります。先般の北朝鮮による弾道ミサイル発射は安保理決議の明白な違反であり非難します。北朝鮮による最近の核・ミサイル活動は我が国より平和で安全な世界のためには全ての国が軍備管理・軍縮の国際的な取り組みに透明性を持った形で真摯に取り組むことが重要です。
Prime Minister Suga's remark come as he is meeting at the White House with the leaders of the U.S., India, and Australia for the first in-person Quad Leader Summit to discuss the Indo-Pacific security.
Meanwhile, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison says Australia's interests are inextricably linked to an open, inclusive, and resilient Indo-Pacific in a pre-recorded speech to the UN General Assembly. Take a look.
Australia's interests are inextricably linked to an open, inclusive, and resilient Indo-Pacific, a region where the rights of all states, no matter how large or how small, are protected. This is what we believe. Australia continues to work constructively on this goal with agency and purpose and commitment, passionately building a network of partnerships and relationships that support these goals. And with our long-standing friends and allies, the United States and the United Kingdom. Strengthened, of course, further last week with the announcement of our new enhanced trilateral security partnership, AUKUS, designed to further the cause of peace, stability and security in the Indo-Pacific region for the benefit of all who live within that region.
AUKUS was unveiled only last week and centers so far on a project for Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines using US and British technology, although it will take years for Australia's Navy to actually get the vessels. The announcement sent waves around the world, angering China and separately causing a furious row with France, which saw its previously negotiated contract for selling Australia conventional submarines thrown out.
And with our long-standing friends and allies, the United
Meanwhile, fresh volcanic eruptions in Spain's Canary Islands prompted the cancellation of flights. Airport authorities said Friday, the first since the Cumbre Vieja volcano came to life again. Take a look. Visiting the island, Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez announced La Palma would be a zone affected by a catastrophe which opens financial aid to residents. Take a listen.
En primer lugar, trasladar desde el Gobierno de España toda la solidaridad con las familias afectadas por esta erupción del volcán.
New evacuations were also ordered as large explosions and new openings were reported at the volcano on La Palma Island on Friday. A large cloud of thick black ash spewed into the air, forcing several airlines to call off their flights. La Palma had 6 inter-island flights scheduled for Friday, operated by Binter, Canary Fly, and Air Europa, while the national carrier Iberia had a single service from Madrid to the mainland. All were scrapped. They were the first flights to be canceled since the volcano erupted on Sunday. Authorities also ordered new evacuations, adding to the 6,100 people already forced to leave to area this week, including 400 tourists. The compulsory evacuation order was issued in parts of El Paso town on La Palma Island, given the increased risk for the population due to the current eruptive episode, according to the regional government. According to the European Union's Copernicus Earth Observation Program, the lava has so far destroyed 300 buildings and covered more than 180 hectares or 445 acres of land. The speed of the lava flowing from the mouth of the volcano has steadily slowed in recent days, and experts are hoping it will not reach the coast. If the molten lava pours into the sea, experts fear it will generate clouds of toxic gas into the air, also affecting marine environment.
In other news, the Hong Kong pro-democracy group that organized 3 decades of annual vigils commemorating the victims of Beijing's Tiananmen Square crackdown now voted to disband on Saturday in the face of China's sweeping clampdown on dissent in the city. The Hong Kong Alliance was one of the most prominent symbols of the city's former political plurality, and its dissolution is the latest illustration of how quickly China is remolding the business hub in its own authoritarian image. Many of the alliance's leaders are already in jail for taking part in the city's democracy movement. Earlier this month, police charged 3 senior figures with subversion, a national security crime. That same week, officers raided a shuttered museum the group ran commemorating Beijing's deadly 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown, hauling away exhibits, memorabilia, and photographs of the historic event. Police also ordered the group to take down its website and social media platforms, and authorities also vowed to revoke its registration as a company.
In other news, thousands of shark fins were confiscated by Colombian authorities before they could be illegally shipped to Hong Kong, according to officials. Bogota seized 3,493 shark fins and 117 kilos of fish bladders that were en route to Hong Kong, and according to Environmental Ministry Head Carolina Urrutia. The haul highlights the continued demand for shark fin served at wedding banquets in some Chinese communities and falsely believed to have medicinal properties. The fins, removed from 900 to 1,000 sharks measuring up to 5 meters, were found on Friday in 5 boxes in Bogota's busiest airport, El Dorado. Shark fishing has been banned in Colombia, which is home to 76 of the 500 known shark varieties since 2020 in an attempt to stem Asia's fin trade. And the news continues here on Eagle News. We'll be right back.
Mula noon hanggang ngayon, gabay natin ang MTRCB ratings sa matalino at responsableng panonood. Sa tamang pagsunod sa MTRCB ratings, ginagawa nating ligtas at makabuluhan ang panonood ng bawat miyembro ng pamilyang Pilipino. Lumipas man ang panahon, hanggang may pamilyang Pilipino, andyan ang MTRCB.
Events happen around us all the time, in our community, in our country, around the world. Events that affect people, move communities, or simply inspire us. Interesting events that people need to know. In these interesting times, we continue to be a competent partner in delivering news about these events. Fast, accurate, balanced. Eagle News, because we live in interesting times.
Welcome back. The South Pacific Territory of American Samoa remains under Code Blue, which calls for minimal precautions such as social distancing and mask wearing, even after confirming its first ever case of COVID-19. Arian Torres of our EBC American Samoa Bureau has more.
We feel very confident that the measures that we put in place has contained this positive where we need it to be so that we can continue to live a normal life out in the public.
The Department of Health has confirmed 1 positive case after results of first COVID-19 test were returned on the evening of quarantine day 3, Thursday, September 16. The positive case was identified among the 43 travelers quarantined at Sadie's by the Sea Hotel in Utulay. No positive cases were identified after testing 217 travelers quarantined at the Tradewinds Hotel. Following the territorial response policy for COVID-19, the traveler who tested positive has since been transported to the isolation facility at the Department of Health Alternate Care Facility 2. The traveler was asymptomatic when tested and will continue to be monitored. This individual is fully vaccinated, and preliminary findings by DOH indicate this is not a historical positive case. The 10-day quarantine requirements upon arrival has allowed the medical team to continue the close monitoring of travelers and minimize the risk of community transmission. The governor and lieutenant governor and public health officials urge the public to remain calm, practice mask wearing, hand washing, and social distancing until further updates are announced.
Travel is not encouraged. I mean, lest everybody forgot, we're in the midst of a pandemic. People who want to go on vacation, I strongly discourage that. And we've always strongly discouraged that. If you're just planning to go to vacation in Las Vegas or whatever, don't do it. This is not a time to get up and go travel. There's a danger out there. And the only safe place in the world, one of the very few safe places in the world, is right here in American Samoa.
American Samoa remain in code blue, and all the flights scheduled to Samoa has been suspended until further notice. This is Arian Torres, Eagle News. We live in interesting times. Fa'afetai Telelava.
Vaccine passports or proof of vaccination is now in effect across the province of Ontario, Canada. Here's Joshua Santillano of our EBC Canada Bureau with that story.
Vaccine passports, or proof of vaccination, is now in effect across the province of Ontario, Canada, starting Wednesday, September 22nd. Premier Doug Ford announced the coming of vaccine passports a few weeks ago, preparing Ontarians for another significant change in the way people assess some select services. Proof of vaccination and identity must be presented to access certain indoor businesses and settings. Proof of identity could be any of these following documents: birth certificate, driver's license, health card or passport, citizenship card, permanent resident card, or Indian status or Indigenous membership card. Proof of vaccination may be downloaded at covid19.ontariohealth.ca. Here are some of the indoor public settings that will require vaccine certificates. Indoor areas of meeting and event spaces, which include banquet halls and convention centers, restaurant and food establishment excluding delivery, takeout, and outdoor patios, indoor gyms and sports facilities, concert venues, theaters, and cinemas. Indoor areas where film and TV production take place with studio audience. Premier Doug Ford encourages everyone to be patient with the rollout of the vaccine certificate program. Take a listen.
A proof of vaccination is required to select settings. Please be patient as we roll the vaccine certificate program out. Do not take your frustrations out on businesses or their staff. We know this will be tough for some, but we owe it to our businesses to do everything we can to avoid lockdowns.
Well, today is the first day of our certification process, which means that when you want to go inside, whether it's to work out at a gym, fitness center, perhaps go out with your family for a meal inside a restaurant, we are asking that you show proof of vaccination. It's very simple. All you need is the card, the piece of paper that you already received when you got your vaccination.
The province of Ontario reported Wednesday 463 new cases of COVID-19, 332 cases of which are not fully vaccinated, 187 people are in the ICU, and 178 of those in the ICU are not fully vaccinated. In Toronto, Joshua Santillana, Eagle News. We live in interesting times.
An energy crisis in the Essex countryside of England. Fertilizer and carbon dioxide shortages are beginning to bite at places like Wickes Manor Farm. To tell us more about it, here's Patricia Rodriguez.
The tranquil landscape of flat farmland and small villages in the Essex countryside in southeast England seems a world away from Britain's escalating energy crisis. But fertilizer and carbon dioxide shortages are beginning to bite at places like Wickes Manor Farm, which rears pigs for pork and grows crops. Fertilizer is needed for crops and carbon dioxide for the humane slaughter of livestock, as well as in the production and packaging of sausages, burger, bacon, and ham. If the shortages continue, there are fears farms like Wicks Manor could be left unable to slaughter animals and make low-yield harvests unprofitable. Britain is not alone in being hit by surging gas prices caused by a global supply shortage, driving a spike in wholesale costs that threaten to hike bills for consumers. But the sharp increase led two UK fertilizer production sites, which rely on natural gas, to halt operations last week, with a knock-on effect on livestock farming and the supply chain. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct of fertilizer production, and the two plants account for up to 60% of Britain's carbon dioxide supply. Let's listen in to farmer and owner of Wicks Manor, Fergus Howie, on his concerns regarding the CO2 shortage.
So we do about 110 pigs a week here at Wicks Manor. They go off to the abattoir every Friday. If the abattoir is unable to source those pigs for us, then our own supply chains are going to run dry because we need that meat for our products here at Wicks Manor. Secondly, we're going to end up having a critical issue on farm because every week we have pigs born. Exactly, so on the back of these concerns of too many pigs on farms, up to about 100,000 pigs more than there ought to be still on farm at the moment, up and down the UK, causing welfare issues. On the back of that, we've now got CO2 shortage, meaning that abattoirs can't process those pigs. And if they are processed, you can't pack the meat for sale because it hasn't got a long enough shelf life. No product. It's crazy that there is only two plants, crazy that they are both under foreign investment. Real concerns on immediate food supply chain. Longer term, farmers need artificial fertiliser to grow their crops for next year's harvest. Rumbling in the background is the concern over next year's harvest. If it's a low harvest because there's no fertiliser to boost those crop yields, prices are going to go up. So what the government needs to do is do a deal with CF Industries to open both plants. Then we need to have some negotiation with the European plants so that we have consistency of supply that we would normally expect from those foreign imports of power and artificial fertiliser, CO2 and artificial fertiliser. And then longer term, we need to start looking at why we have such a fragile food supply chain in the UK, and we need to have investment in more plants, or different technology, so we don't rely on natural gas.
Before the CO2 crisis, Howie was already sending 25% fewer pigs to slaughter due to chronic staff shortages at slaughterhouses caused by a double whammy of the Brexit and the pandemic. Reporting from London, United Kingdom, I'm Patricia Rodriguez. We live in interesting times.
Vaccination numbers have risen in the recent days in Switzerland following requirement to provide a COVID-19 certificate or a vaccination or negative test to enter indoor cultural locations and restaurants. John Kevin Glauser reports.
The Swiss government has recently extended the obligation to present a COVID pass in the country. Now it is mandatory for people of 16 years old and above to present a valid COVID pass to be allowed to sit in a restaurant, a concert hall, a theater, or visit a museum and other indoor places. It is also the case for events with more than 1,000 people and political or religious gatherings of more than 50 people. The consequences for not respecting these new rules can be expensive. 100 Swiss francs for individuals and up to 10,000 Swiss francs for the organization or establishment responsible. To sum up, people must now either be fully vaccinated, recovered from the virus, or present a negative COVID test to take part in such social activities. However, rapid self-tests, which used to be free, are not anymore. That is why a lot of people still reluctant when it comes to the vaccine finally decided to get theirs. Authorities in the different cantons of Switzerland noticed a significant rise in the demand for vaccination, either with or without appointment, since the announcement of the new rule. For example, in the canton of Valais, demands for vaccination went from 314 to 1,275 in just one day, and the same trend was shown in the other regions of the country. To face this sudden rise in demand for the vaccine, vaccination centers had to adapt their schedule and make more doses available. Fortunately, this new restriction was anticipated, and places like the HUG in Geneva, for example, is now able to stay open even during the weekend, and the vaccination capacity has been raised to more than 20,000 doses per week compared to the 19,000 first doses administered during the whole month of August. This is John Kevin Glauser reporting from Geneva, Switzerland, and we live in interesting times.
Meanwhile, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention overruled its own panel of health experts to back Pfizer COVID vaccine booster shots for individuals at high risk of exposure because of their jobs. CDC Director Rochelle Walensky said the agency had to act on complex, often imperfect data for the greater good of public health. Take a look.
At the conclusion of the meeting, the advisory committee had a robust discussion about whether boosters should be available for those at high risk of COVID because of occupational or institutional risk. People like healthcare workers, teachers, frontline responders, essential workers, and those in congregate settings. The result of their discussion was a close vote. Had I been in the room and on the committee, I would have voted yes. And that is reflected in my resulting decision to allow the use of Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 booster dose for those 18 and older at high risk of COVID-19 exposure and transmission because of occupational and institutional exposure. As CDC director, it's my job to recognize where our actions can have the greatest impact. In a pandemic, we most often take steps with the intention to do the greatest good, even in an uncertain environment. And that
the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, they've completed their independent scientific review. And based on that review, the majority of Americans who were fully vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine are now able to receive the booster shot 6 months after they've received their second shot. Those eligible include, in addition to meeting the requirement of 6 months after the second shot, those people are 65 years or older, adults 18 and over with certain underlying health conditions like diabetes and obesity, and those who are at increased risk of COVID-19 because of where they work or where they live, like healthcare workers, teachers, grocery store workers.
Now, earlier, the hours-long debate left several experts torn as the scientific community has so far failed to reach consensus on whether a coronavirus vaccine booster shot is necessary at this time. Some experts have concerns about the lack of data on the efficacy and safety of adding another shot to the Pfizer vaccine regimen. They say the original 2 doses are still proving successful at keeping the vast majority of their recipients out of the hospital with coronavirus.
Now, here in the Philippines, the Department of Health observed a slower rate of increase in COVID-19 cases in the National Capital Region, or NCR, and at the national level. Health Undersecretary Maria Rosario Vergeire said that the large decline in reported cases may have been largely affected by the rapid and large decline in RT-PCR laboratory output. Take a look.
We have observed over the past month that while reported cases remained high at the national level and at the National Capital Region, there was a slower rate of increase. This slowdown in new cases was reflected in the positive but lower 2-week growth rates over the past month and a similar decline in the RT. Our RT remains to be more than 1, signaling continuous infection of at least 1 additional per case, and we need to reduce and sustain this to less than 1. The large decline in reported cases may have been largely affected by the rapid and large decline in the RT-PCR laboratory output. Thus, the need to interpret our case metrics carefully and the ongoing assessment of the Department of Health to determine what factors led to this much lower test output.
Meanwhile, India will export 8 million coronavirus vaccine jabs by the end of October after ending its ban on sending doses abroad, according to a top foreign ministry official today. Now, Prime Minister Narendra Modi promised to resume exports at a meeting of leaders from the so-called Quad in Washington as India, Japan, Australia, and the U.S. try to counter growing Chinese influence across the Asia-Pacific region. Foreign Secretary Harsh Vardhan Shringla told reporters on Saturday that most of the 8 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson single-shot vaccine will be sent to Asia-Pacific countries. India is one of the world's biggest vaccine producers and had pledged earlier this year to export 1 billion COVID jabs by December next year. But New Delhi halted exports in May after a devastating coronavirus wave ravaged the country. India lifted its vaccine export ban this week, with new COVID-19 infections and deaths slowing down.
Eagle News will be back with more stories. Please don't go away.
Mula noon hanggang ngayon, gabay natin ang MTRCB ratings sa matalino at responsableng panonood. Sa tamang pagsunod sa MTRCB ratings, ginagawa nating ligtas at makabuluhan ang panonood ng bawat miyembro ng pamilyang Pilipino. Lumipas man ang panahon, hanggang may pamilyang Pilipino, andyan ang MTRCB.
Mainit at maanghang ang ating pag-uusapan. Ang naglalagablab na sarap ng sili. Matapang ka ba? Matapang ka ba sa anghang? Malakas ba ang loob mo na subukan ng pagninegosyo? Baka sili ang para sa'yo.
Ginigising mo yung mga antibodies ng katawan mo. Yun ang epekto ng sili. Kasi nagre-release yung katawan mo ng endorphin.
Ito po ay 30 varieties ng sili kasalukuyan ng ating napabunga. Eat all you can together.
Almost ng mga menu namin, may sili talaga.
Naisipan kong gumawa ng hot sauce. Then it became an instant hit.
Napakaulan, malamig. Ang sili maganda. So wala kang problema, hindi namimili ng lugar. No? Makisali ko kayo sa pagsisili, malaki ang kita sa sili.
Ako po, si Robin Padilla. At ito po ang unlad. Kaagapay sa hanap buhay.
Welcome back to the news. First, in the business, the Philippine economy will take a decade to go back to its pre-pandemic growth path due to the lingering effects of the pandemic and the lockdowns. That according to the National Economic and Development Authority, or NEDA. In a statement on Saturday, Socio-Economic Planning Secretary Carl Kendrick Chua said the pandemic and the lockdowns imposed by the government are expected to cost the Philippine economy a total of 41.4 trillion pesos in the next 40 years. NEDA said another key finding of the study is that workers' productivity will also be lower due to untimely death, illness, and lack of face-to-face schooling. The impact of these on productivity is likely to be permanent over the next 40 years, or the average number of years a person is expected to work in his or her lifetime.
In other business news, despite assurances by the government that the UK is not running out of petrol, customers are still queuing on roadsides outside petrol stations in Kent, southeast England, in a bid to fill up their tanks after BP was forced to close some forecourts this week due to a lack of drivers. Here's Nicole Salenga from our EBC UK Bureau. Nicole?
Britain on Friday urged the public not to panic buy fuel as some petrol stations closed pumps due to a lack of tanker delivery drivers, adding to the government's growing list of woes and stoking consumer fears of worse to come before Christmas. The Road Haulage Association, a sector body, said driver shortages caused by the pandemic and Brexit had created a perfect storm, as calls mounted on ministers to take swift action. "We're running on empty," the Sun tabloid warned on its front page, after weeks of increasing supply chain issues have left some supermarket shelves bare. However, Transport Secretary Grant Shapps insisted there was no fuel shortage and promised the government would get more lorry drivers to deliver stock. The advice would be to carry on as normal, Shapps told Sky News, after a number of UK petrol stations run by BP and ExxonMobil-owned Esso were forced to close. Shell said it had seen increased demand and was adapting its delivery schedules as queues built up on petrol station forecourts and some types of fuel ran out. At least 50 of BP's 1,200 service stations were out of at least one type of fuel, the Times reported, while BP told AFP a handful of sites had temporarily closed. Industry insiders said the lack of fuel deliveries was confined to southeastern England and appeared to be temporary, but was part of a wider problem. BP blamed industry-wide driver shortages across the UK. Gordon Balmer of the Petrol Retailers Association cited supply pressure from a lack of trained HGV or heavy goods vehicle drivers, despite demand at 92% of pre-pandemic levels. Experts and business leaders say Brexit and the pandemic have cut the number of truck drivers working in Britain, hitting supply chains in sectors from food to building supplies. Many drivers who have left Britain were from Eastern Europe and returned home due to the global health crisis or to avoid falling foul of tougher immigration rules. A similar situation has affected seasonal fruit pickers, despite a government visa waiver scheme. We're 100,000 drivers short at the moment, including 20,000 European drivers who have left the country because of Brexit, RHA spokesman Rod Mackenzie told BBC Television. Shapps, though, denied Brexit was to blame, calling critics wrong and highlighting similar issues affecting EU countries. His department recently announced an overhaul for HGV driving tests to get more drivers behind the wheel as soon as possible. The government has been facing a separate crisis over carbon dioxide stocks, vital to the food and drink industry, due to a spike in wholesale gas prices. But while saying he was ruling nothing out, Shapps rebuffed industry calls to add truck drivers to a special list of industries suffering labor shortages to make it easier for EU citizens to obtain work visas. He said he preferred to get those people back in to driving who had been put off the job by lower pay offered when European workers were plentiful. Britain was also keen to entice back European truck drivers who have gained the necessary status to work in the UK but are currently overseas, he added. The Times reported the government could draft in the army to deliver fuel and that ministers had discussed putting soldiers on standby. Reporting from London, United Kingdom, I am Nicole Salenga. We live in interesting times.
Squealing rubber, raging engines, dizzying revs and smoke. The sport of spinning is bursting out of the underground motorsports world and making a name for itself. It was born in the townships of Soweto, South Africa, as a ritual to honor fallen gangsters during the apartheid era. Now, fast forward 2 decades later, and spinning has transformed to become Africa's biggest motorsports. It is a wild mix of drifting and personal expression, which involves drivers locking their car into a spin and then, amid screeching tires and clouds of smoke, climbing out of the car to perform moves on the bodywork or even hang upside down from the window with their head just millimeters above the ground. For spinners, the key goal is to entertain the crowd with their high-octane theatrics, and expensive high-tech cars aren't needed to achieve this. However, a classic BMW 32.5i is still the pinnacle choice car for serious contenders. That looks so fun. The more dangerous it is, the more entertaining. But please don't try that if you do not have a background or if you're not trained for it. And that's it for tonight's broadcast. Thank you so much for joining us this whole week. I am CJ Hero. The news continues on Monday.
And at the end of the day, there remains so much more to be grateful for. We'll see you back on Monday. I'm Alma Angeles, and
we live in interesting times.